I'm having medical intuition. But every time there's a code red or a code blue, I notice teams of angelics, ancestors, or beloveds circling around a person as they're about to transition. And at the moment the transition's about to occur, a beautiful pillar of light would come around the entire being. I would sit there just watching as the soul body left the actual human vessel. That really threw me for a loop. Am I hallucinating? Would you like to just share your near-death experience story, any information leading up to it or whatever you feel is relevant? Yes, of course. So in 2010, I was in the candidacy for my doctorate in clinical psychology, and I was kind of burning the candle a little too hard at both ends. And so in the years prior, I had actually been struggling with a host of health challenges. And doctors at the time believed it was the byproduct of my pursuing multiple master's degrees in unison and taking too many credits and just really wearing myself down. So I did follow their advice and I slowed down a little bit and my health returned to me. However, when I went back into my doctoral studies a few years later, after becoming licensed as a therapist, the pattern started to repeat. And I noticed I was working with trauma at the time, and I am myself a polytrauma survivor. And I was noticing that my sessions were going beautifully and my clients were having these profound shifts, but I would come home and it was like the vital life force energy had been ripped out of me. There was absolutely nothing left. And, at the time I didn't understand because I hadn't been taught. Being a clinical psychologist, it's not taught in Western approaches to either psychiatry, psychology, or medicine, the importance of energetic boundaries and how to really clear a room after you've dealt with some very heavy things. And then also to be very mindful of how you're posturing yourself and how you're receiving information so that you're not literally taking it on as an empathetic sponge or according to that person or really just taking their pain for them. So I wasn't cognizant of that where I could vocalize it, but there was a budding inner awareness that something about this dynamic was informing what was happening in my body. And so I went to see a bunch of premier specialists throughout Los Angeles, and I kept receiving different autoimmune diagnoses. Never the same thing twice. The tests are very inconsistent. It's been that way for a long time with autoimmunity. So sometimes my Rh factor would lend itself to one diagnosis, and another time it'd be a different. But basically what was happening were my lungs were extraordinarily weak. I was getting chronic pneumonia or chronic bronchitis or co-occurring bronchitis with pneumonia, and it would last for months at a time. I had to be on very high dose prednisone to combat that. And then I was having a lot of severe back pain, which we realized it was the kidneys. And so now they're realizing it's not just the lungs, the kidneys are involved. And at that point, I also started just having complete lockdown of the joints, like hands that wouldn't move, wake up purple and swollen, jaw locking, and nobody could get it open, even in an ER. So just a lot of joint pain. And so it did present as classic autoimmunity. It's just what was the etiology? They were really struggling to put their finger on that. And so I was on so much medication that did not make me feel well. The side effects of drugs, in allopathy, they call them side effects, but they're genuinely the effects of the drug. And so I was living with all these effects of the Western medicine, and it was compromising my already fragile system and energetic body. And yet I continued to march forward with the work. Eventually, my inner knowing led me to realize I needed to see different doctors and look at this through a different perspective. And so I found out that Johns Hopkins had the leading autoimmune research center in the world. And I just so happened to be from near Johns Hopkins. So I really diligently applied, and given the complexity of my medical history and that it had been almost at this point 7 years of dealing with this as a young person who had previously been in good health, they accepted me. It was like a 6-month wait list, but I was excited just because I got in. And my NDE ended up occurring as I was waiting to get into Hopkins to be seen. So I fly back east, eager to be seen. And again, the appointment's given to me kind of on the whim because there's a cancellation. So my family who lives there, who would otherwise have taken me to the hospital, happened to be on an international cruise. And I have the worst flare up that I ever recall. And that's what little I can recall of it. The pain became so crippling. I just couldn't get out of bed. I was struggling to breathe, even with an oxygen tank and a nebulizer right there beside the bed. I was turning purple in my hands and everything was locking. The pain was just unbearable. And so I called every specialist I had at my Los Angeles hospital, and they told me to not hesitate to take the medication as directed. There was no danger to it, that it was prescribed to me for this exact reason. I'd be in Hopkins like in a day or two. Just take the medication. Unbeknownst to them and unbeknownst to me at the time, my liver was failing. So by taking the medication, even in the order that they had suggested and had said was safe, my already compromised liver could not tolerate the most benign substance that was in the medication, which was Tylenol. It was not in a high enough dose to harm a healthy person. But for someone whose liver was already compromised, it ended up taking the liver so catastrophically fast that it took the kidneys and the lungs with it. So in the instant that I took the medication, I was very blessed, divine timing. My family walks in from their trip. I have no recollection of this. I'm giving you what they've told me and also what medical records reflect. And so I'm on the bed and I'm practically unconscious. They think I'm dead because I'm so swollen. I've turned completely purple. I am jaundice everywhere and I'm non-responsive. Eventually they do get a response and they see that I'm very shallowly breathing. And at that point, I just start wailing in pain, like screaming in pain. So they get me to the ER, the local ER. And again, I have no recollection of this. I'm coming in and out of consciousness at this point. And the local ER hears the level of pain that I'm in. And of course, they empathetically want to treat the pain. Well, what do? They shoot me up with high-dose morphine. Now, my liver has already gone. It's at that point that I just go out because the body can't take anymore. I was flown from that point from the local hospital to Johns Hopkins, and it's in the ICU of Johns Hopkins wherein my NDE begins. I've always been a lucid dreamer and capable of astral projections and things of the sort. And so when I saw myself, from above, as I was coming out of the body, I'm looking down and I just feel that I'm in a dream. And so I'm trying to shift myself out of the dream or back into the body because it was a scary sight to see the body like that. At first, it was intriguing. I was like, oh, look, I'm in this episode of the X-Files and they're working on someone because they're wearing full hazmat suits. And we're used to seeing this now because of the pandemic. But before, you weren't used to seeing the mask and the tube coming out and all of that. But they were working on me just like that because I was so incredibly sick and the risk of any kind of infection or contamination would have killed me. And so I see all that and I'm interested. And then I'm like, that's my body. It's virtually unrecognizable, but that's me. So then I'm starting to be curious about, well, if that's me, what's this? What's going on? And in the time that my consciousness and your consciousness, when you have this near-death experience, for many of us, your consciousness still retains your personality. So there were still those parts of me that were silly and goofy and thinking it's an X-Files episode. But yet, then there were the higher parts of me as well, which start realizing very rapidly, hey, we're separated from our body, and this is not a dream. and we're being pulled into something because all of a sudden it was like this magnet was just pulling me. And that's when the ride began. And I lost this realm and was instantly transported to a more celestial, cosmic realm. The way I often describe it is take the most beautiful pictures you've seen from NASA and just turn the saturation all the way up to the purest Technicolor. That was it. I was in this beautiful cosmic space. And as soon as I arrived, it was like all of those questions that I had, all of the curiosity about the body, all the identification with who I was or am, it just evaporated. Because suddenly in this space, I was being held. And I was being held in this way it's truly ineffable. I've never experienced being held in this lifetime the way that I was held there. And it was like I was just melting into this divine love. And at the same time it was holding me, there was this inner knowing that I was holding part of myself because what was holding me, I was part of. And so it was at that time that what I refer to as my angelics or guides, the vernacular doesn't matter, but 3 orbs of light that I had recognized immediately. As soon as I saw them, I was like, I know you. I've known you since childhood. They were so recognizable and their presence brought so much peace and validation because as a child, I had shared seeing these orbs and these energies and feeling the angelics. And I had been told, because I grew up in a very religious, dogmatic Roman Catholic family, that these were exaggerations and that these were fantasies. And I was telling stories and I couldn't understand as a human at that time why, a religion that honored the angels and this realm couldn't be open to a child receiving these energies. And so there was a disconnect that happened for me very young with religion. But that said, in this space, I knew exactly what they were. They were angels. And it didn't matter if angels were associated to spirituality or religion or any of that. They were just these divine beings that have this vibration that was so healing. And I knew because they communicate in that realm through telepathy or inner knowing that they had been with me, not just in this lifetime, not just in this body, but basically throughout all time and space. So being with them, I felt just so incredibly supported. And then the questioning kind of came back on because I'm looking around me and I'm noticing this beautiful source light. And I am magnetized to it. There wasn't a tunnel for me, but rather this just magnificent, huge, larger than life, larger than a galaxy light. And it was calling me in. And yet it was this very soft call, almost as if I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. But it wasn't that I had to run to it. And yet there was part of me that wanted to just instantly merge and harmonize with this light. And so the angelics, very lovingly in light language or telepathy, how they communicate, they really let me know that it was okay, that I had a choice, that I was in this in-between state and that I could go to that light, which I was a part of, I was a fractal of, and that we were all fractals of. And then I could return to it and I would be welcome and I would be loved and received. Or I could stay and I could continue the work that I had signed up for, in a sense, with my soul mission and purpose and contract. And when I say in a sense, I want to clarify for persons because there tends to be this assumption that soul contracts are not mutable, that they are fixed and cannot change throughout all time and space. And the gift of my NDE, which I'll get into more later, is that I really learned that they can be shifted and that they can be altered, but it takes work. And so Spirit let me know you have the opportunity to go back to this body. Now, Imagine you're a polytrauma survivor and you've been enduring trauma since before you were a teen, and it was ongoing and repeated and ritualistic. And all of a sudden they're telling you, go back there. And they add this wonderful buffer, again, in this loving language, though, that we're just not capable of as humans. You're going to go, if you go back, it will be harder. It will be harder for a significant period of time. And yet, you have the strength and resources to do it. You chose to do it. And the work that will come from it will be, it will arrive in a time when you will not be doing it alone. You will be part of a collective team that has chosen to be here together and that is waiting for the shift in humanity and this opportunity. That was intriguing, although I had no clue what they were talking about. But at the same time, there was some part of my soul that was like, yes, this is what we're here for. Yes, this is why we haven't checked out from the trauma. Yes, this is why we fought our depression. This is why we overcame suicidality. Yes, this is why we became a therapist. Like there was all of this like intuitive knowing of everything that has happened before has led us here because we came to be of service. And so as much as what was left of my human lower mind or consciousness in this orb of light that I was in this space, as much as what was left of that was still a little bit scared. And yet being held in that divine love, the angelics and the source light were letting me know it's okay to be scared. It's okay to be a little frightened of the unknown. That doesn't mean you can't do it. And so at this point, they served me a beautiful distraction, or so it felt at the time. But now I know it wasn't a distraction whatsoever. It was really another set of guides, but a much different type of guides that I would be working with upon my return. And so as I spun through this space, which literally moves at the speed of light, I noticed these two lights that were just unlike anything else. They were not the same intense vibration of the angelics. They were not like the stars. They were not like the source light. They were very unique. There was something familiar about them, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And so I was puzzled and mesmerized and enchanted by these lights. And one was the most beautiful indigo I have ever and likely will ever see. And the other was this beautiful earth green, like the freshest grass, the most hydrated grass. And they just beautiful energetic signatures. And I was curious about them, and I could tell they were curious about me too. But they said nothing, and nothing was communicated other than I had a sense that I was to hold them versus being held the way that the other lights were holding me. So again, just curiosity about that. And I returned back to the angelics and just being in the space with this other two lights, feeling the soul resonance of, yeah, I'm scared to go back, but it's calling me. As much as I want to go to that other light, as much as I want to stay in this divine love, there's this part of me that is determined to go back. And in my case, because I was comatose, I was given a choice. Not everyone is. And so I then asked the light and the angelics, how do I get back? If I want to go back, how do I get back? I'm just floating around here. It seems like a beautiful place to stay, but I now feel the call and I want to return. And the instant I said that to them, again, through the heart space and inner knowing, they told me to look for the light unlike any others. And at that point, it's like my orb was just warped around super, super fast. And my consciousness comes into contact with this just blinding artificial light. It is not like the lights that are in this beautiful heavenly celestial space. And I'm anchored and then catapulted back into the human body. And as I open my left eye, I am immediately met with that light. And that light, that was unlike any others, was a very large, bright, neurological flashlight. They had been looking to just check my vitals and see how I was progressing. Now, what's important here is that I had been declared likely brain dead because my Glasgow score, which is how they score you when you're comatose, was so low. And the amount of activity that they were seeing on the brain monitors was very inconsistent and very, very low. So the best prediction was if I survived, and it was a major if, such an if that my family was prepared for me to exit. They were told to go ahead and do the last rites, do whatever they needed to do to begin saying goodbye because the probability was so extraordinarily low. And so they were going through that. They were beginning to grieve. And here I am in a body awake, but I can't communicate. And there was a bit of panic naturally because I've just come from the most heavenly divine space. And then I'm thrown back into this earthly realm, which suddenly feels like hell because I can't move. I don't know what's happened to me and no one knows I'm in there. So I realized after a few moments that I was strapped down to the bed, which is why I couldn't move. And that was because I had a PICC line going into my brain. That was the doctor's attempt to really save my cognitive functioning because my family was well aware that if I returned and I was in a vegetative state, it wouldn't be a quality of life that I would want. And so that was a last-ditch effort to save my brain. And thankfully, it was successful in co-creating, along with spirit, my return. And so I noticed that nothing I did to get their attention was working. They thought it was all involuntary movements because I could only move my left fingers from being strapped down. I could not move the right side at all. The legs and everything else were so swollen and so unable to move because I hadn't moved in days. And so you just end up kind of losing the ability to actually control the legs and the limbs themselves. And I was intubated because the lungs had failed. So I have no way of talking. And so at this point, I noticed that that they're not noticing when I'm moving and that I need someone to come tell me what happened. And I'm also trying to process what just happened on this other side, or was this real? Is this a dream? All of these things are going on. And so I induced a little bit of a panic attack to get their attention. And so they noticed that my vitals are going all over the place. And then I start blinking my left eye, like intentionally. And they said to me, can you hear us? And I'm like, yes. And so then they developed a system where I could speak with one or two blinks, yes and no, yes and no. And then I was like, they realized I was in there. And not only was I in there, I had my full cognitive function. So, I mean, I can still remember the look of shock on everyone's face as they discovered that I was there and attempting to communicate and that I was working to really return. After the immediacy of just wanting the acknowledgement that I was back and an understanding of what had transpired to occur, I realized very quickly I am not the same person that left that body. I wear contacts or glasses because my eyesight's very poor. And they took the contacts out and I didn't have glasses. And so I was noticing like almost like astigmatism or auras around everything. And I thought it was a byproduct of my own astigmatism and the artificial lights in the hospital. But my family quickly brought me in my glasses. And when I put the glasses on, I was like, this should be fixing things, not enhancing it. And instead of clarifying all of that, suddenly I met the fact that my third eye had been catapulted open. Now I'm seeing literal energy fields on persons. I'm seeing disease in the body, family members who I didn't know anything about their physical health
or they weren't even cognizant of it, were coming in to visit. And I was seeing like the formation of disease or things that were happening. And I'm feeling the organ ache in my own organs, which have just failed. There was like this mirroring that was occurring. And so the gift of medical intuition had turned on. The one that scared me the most, if I'm perfectly honest, was that ICU has glass walls. And so when you're in ICU and they're going code red, code blue all night long, and you can't sleep because you can't take any medication due to your organs having failed. And I couldn't sleep because I was processing all of this. You have to remember, I was trained as a clinical psychologist. All of a sudden, now I'm seeing everyone's energy field. I'm sometimes hearing their thoughts that they're not expressing. And I'm having medical intuition. Well, then add to that every time there's a code red or a code blue, I notice through the glass walls, teams of angelics or ancestors or beloveds circling around a person as they're about to transition. And at the moment the transition's about to occur, a beautiful pillar of light would come around the entire being. And then I would sit there, probably with my eyes like this, just watching as the soul body or the ghost body left the actual human vessel. And that really threw me for a loop. Having been a clinician, I was like, am I hallucinating? Am I oriented ×4, which is person, place, time, and situation, which is how we check for mental status and if you are indeed not psychotic in the moment. And I was always oriented ×4. And I was like, how is this possible that I'm seeing all of this? Where is this coming from? And thankfully, prior to this journey, I had had some synchronistic events unfold. And I was working with a Taoist master who had described my guides to me. And so when they returned my phone to me and they took the intubator out like 3 days later, he was my first phone call. And I did not give him a description. I told him I'd had some sort of paranormal or transcendent experience. And I was trying to ground it and understand it. I knew his gifts were legitimate. Could he describe in any way what he was picking up from my field? And he described the near-death experience to me down into detail as to the 3 guides and information that they shared. And my mind was blown. So at that point, I realized they told me over there that all I have to do is ask for assistance. And so that's what I started doing in the hospital room. I was like, you are showing me all of this light coming from my hands. I have no idea what to do with it. Teach me what to do with it. And so I became their student, particularly mostly at nighttime, because that was when the least interruptions to the hospital room would occur and other patients were sleeping. And they really assisted me in the beginning of my training with vibrational medicine. And so the doctors are coming in during the daytime and they're telling me, I need an organ, or I need a liver to survive. I have a 1% chance of survival if I do not get a liver. That my liver count was approximately 250,000, which is unheard of. They actually use the term miracle more times than I can count because they said at 100,000, I should have been dead. So like, we don't even know how you're talking and sitting here, but somehow you are. And so you're going to need a new liver. You're going to have an exceptionally long recovery. We know that you were misdiagnosed. We need to figure out what is the actual ailment underneath this all. The lungs and kidneys are still incredibly compromised. They began talking to me about dialysis for my kidneys and ongoing medication for the lungs. And spirits just starting to talk to me at this point again through inner knowing. And they are like whispering, they're wrong. Don't listen. And so I really began to be grateful for my training in psychology because there were these nuggets of wisdom that were aiding me. I had the blessing of working with Dr. Bruce Lipton and knowing the power of the biology of belief and knowing that what they told me was their opinion. They'd already admitted it was a miracle I was sitting there. So why did any of those other things have to come to fruition? And so by working with the angelics and the teams, it was a Christmas when my coma occurred. It was in December, early December. And so I'm working to recover and they're playing Christmas music nonstop. And the only thing on TV are Christmas movies. And I'll be honest, when you're in a lot of pain, Christmas is not what you want to hear. And so they're telling me I'm going to be in ICU for 6 months. And I'm like, I'm getting out of here before Christmas because I can't take any more of this Christmas stuff. And they're all like, oh, that's cute. That's a nice gesture. We'll see. But they didn't know me and my tenacity when I put my mind and heart to something. And so I was very blessed. I had a friend that happened to be an occupational therapist. So they're telling me that PT is not going to start for months, that I have to stay in bed, that I can't use the bathroom. And so she came one night to just like help me with some other things. And I told her, I said, I'm going to start teaching myself to do things with or without their help. And I'm like, but you have the skill set to assist if you're inclined. And she's like, what do you want to do? I was like, I just want to learn basic stuff, like to move my arms and move so that I can eventually get out of bed and use the bathroom. And so we took baby steps and she really helped me in the first like few days. And then she's like, you don't need me. You're doing this on your own. And so one day the doctor comes in and sees me coming out of the bathroom walking. And they're like, you're walking? And I'm like, yeah, I'm walking. I'm like, I can take the stairs too. And they're like, how did you get to the stairs? And I'm like, I had a little help and I've been practicing. And so they bring the PT in at this point, and she's like, you weren't supposed to be seen for months. And I'm all like, yeah, they keep saying stuff. Let's just let that go in one ear and out the other. We're good. Let's do this. And so I could only do 3 steps that first day. And then she worked with me. And by the next day, I was up the whole flight of stairs. And it was just like these rapid progression. And so at night, I would continue with working with the hands of light and the angelics. And by the 21st of December, my goal came true. I had been moved from a lower level of care from ICU already. And my liver count, which again was still in the hundreds of thousands when I first woke up, in 3.5 weeks, it returned to the optimal range. It went from there to, I believe, optimal's 21 to 45. And so, yeah, I got the optimal range. They actually discharged me a few days before Christmas, still with the stern warning that I was going to need a year or 2 of rehabilitation and physical therapy. And I was still learning how to talk and things like that again from the intubation. But it was defying all of their odds. And one of the most skeptical doctors who really thought there was no way I'd ever walk out of the hospital, it was very interesting to receive his energy with my newfound gifts. Yet he came up to me, they were wheeling me out, and he was like, I have to shake your hand. He's like, in medical terms, what you've accomplished is called spontaneous remission. He's like, I've never used this word, but I'll use it now. He's like, they were right. This is a miracle. And he's like, I don't know how you did it, but you did it. And he shook my hand, and I humbly accepted that beautiful gesture and went home with my family. And it was a very long road from then on, because as beautiful as the gifts were, they shattered who I believed I was, who I knew myself to be. And I had invested so much in all of my degrees, not just financially, but energetically, passionately. I firmly wanted to be a clinician. I enjoyed it. And yet I took this long leave of absence to heal. But when I tried to return to clinical psychology and to just defend my dissertation, which was all that was left, I realized I wasn't aligned with that dissertation. It just did not go with who I was anymore. So I attempted to get the school to allow me to like recraft it and reshape it and integrate some of my newfound knowing. And they were really turned off by all this near-death stuff and didn't really want to hear it. And they were like, no, you had a strong clinical paper. All you have to do is defend it. The dissertation doesn't matter. Write about that later. But to me, it mattered greatly because this was the first piece I was going to be putting out with the title doctor. This was the foundation, of my work. And suddenly I realized I couldn't do that. So it was either I start all over on the dissertation or I walk away. And so I took another leave to really sit with that. And at that point, I go into transpersonal psychology because I knew there was room for consciousness and near-death experiences and things of that nature. But interestingly, even in that community, it triggered my autoimmunity to come back on. And so I ended up studying for a while, but realizing my body was communicating some sort of wisdom that I was not receiving. And so I left. And I left with extended absences at both schools to leave my doors open so that if I wanted to go back. But on an inner knowing level, I already knew I wasn't going to finish. And that was a sort of ego death because while my soul was okay with it, and now I fully understand why, but my soul was okay with it, my human was not. And so I just kept trying to find ways to stay the same person. But to stay the same person, I couldn't fully honor who I woke up as and my gifts, nor could I nurture them because I had no understanding of how to do that. If I'm denying them or actively suppressing them because of trying to fit in and be mainstream and not be stigmatized or pathologized, I was really just hiding a lot of them. And finding that there were certain foods that lowered my vibration or alcohol. I could have that with friends and that would lower my vibration and it would turn everything off. But when my vibration was in this lower state and I wasn't in alignment with my gifts, I also felt like I wasn't alive. It was as if I were back in that body before I had shifted to the other side. And so there was a very profound series of dark nights of the souls for me. One thing that sometimes gets glossed over in NDE discussions is there's a lot of emphasis on the beauty and totality of the near-death experience. And there's a lot of emphasis on the beautiful after effects and then the missions of service that the person's put out into the world. But between those things is a significant period of reintegration. And at that moment, I just want to honor all of the souls that have not made it through that period. There are roughly, and these statistics, in my humble opinion, are outdated, but they are the current statistics. Approximately 7 of adult near-death experiencers will complete suicide upon their return. They will get back here, and despite everything that they experienced, they will deem this incarnation too hard to be in. And because they've experienced the unconditional love of the divine, where there is no judgment, there is no shame, there is no guilt. I did not have a life review because I was in a coma, and it seems to be that comas vary a little differently as we're in a longer in-between space. That said, I had done some things that were less than my highest and best to cope with the trauma. And I'm not blaming myself. It was survival mode. It was the best I could do at the time. But they are things that from a traditional standpoint would be judged and I would be held accountable for if God or source or the light or whatever vernacular you choose was and is not all loving. Yet there was none of that. And that itself is where the danger comes in for experiencers that are struggling to reintegrate. Because knowing that you are not going to be judged, you're not going to be forsaken, you're not going to go to hell for committing suicide, leaves an open door for some who simply cannot take the level of suffering, who feel that they have no support here. who don't know about the resources that are out there, or feel that everything is out of pocket and they don't have the financial resources for that. And so I was very fortunate. My time in psychology and transpersonal psychology as well, I was aware of the near-death community. I was aware of where to look for resources. And so that's what I did. And I eventually began going, and I was a wallflower. I didn't want to say anything, but I went to these events and I would just take in and feel that there were others like me. What I quickly learned was that when we are together, those of us that are very psychically activated, we amplify each other's gifts. And so that actually in itself catapulted another sort of dark night of the soul, because I couldn't ground myself. I was in these conferences and suddenly I'm seeing everybody's stuff, and it's not welcoming. It's not comfortable. It doesn't feel safe. And so that's really where I began learning how to reach out for assistance and find teachers and paths to ground and embody the gifts. So yes, at these conferences, the gifts would become so amplified that I would go out of my body. I'd get really scared. We had experiencer rooms, but I was too scared to talk about what I was experiencing because everybody was talking about how fantastic it was. And I'm like, this is not fantastic. This is terrifying. I was also pregnant with my first son at the time, who's also an intuitive. And so I was picking up on what he was feeling and receiving in this space. And it was just a lot. And so from there, I realized if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to embody these gifts, if I'm going to figure out what spirit meant by that whole timeline of service and what's forthcoming. And the irony is this happens to be 2012. And the conference theme was obviously on that. And we had a lot of Mayan and Tibetan elders that were talking about the 2012 prophecies and how they had been misunderstood, and that it wasn't really the end of the world, but the beginning of the end of the world as we knew it. And that in the decade to come, a massive shift and opportunity in human conscious and evolution, and the potential for the golden era of consciousness was being birthed. And there was something about them saying that, and them being indigenous persons that were extraordinarily grounded, that this inner knowing of seek out a shaman came to me. Mm-hmm. And so I then began I just was asking spirit, show me the way. And one by one, 3 shamans from 3 different traditions just showed up. And I worked with all 3. One was of a Taoist tradition. One was of indigenous Native American traditions. And one kind of had their very own unique brand and spin where they integrated many different. And with working with them, the earth medicine, their ability to ground me back into the body. Because remember, again, as a trauma survivor, I spent decades dissociating just to survive the abuse. Now I can go out of my body even further whenever I want and go into the celestial realms and all of that. Very beautiful, but also not a great way to accomplish things and get things done on the ground. So I started working with these shamans, and they were so beautiful and delicate in that they shared how really my whole life path from birth to the present moment had been a shamanic initiation. I was born with a physical health challenge, the lungs themselves impaired. And so we began to look at what organs failed. Well, it was the lungs, it was the liver, it was the kidneys. In wisdom traditions, in ancient medicine, in Chinese medicine, those organs, the lungs, they hold anger. All the anger I suppressed towards the trauma I endured, to the person that hurt me, I pushed it towards myself. I took accountability because I felt I had done something to deserve it. And so my lungs literally couldn't take anymore, and they failed. Then there's the kidney, fear. I lived in fear every day during those years of trauma because I knew that it was just a matter of time before that process would repeat and repeat and repeat.
Mm-hmm.
And despite efforts to find help, despite disclosing, no one believed me. No one validated my story. No one, and so there was so much fear that I was carrying. And then additionally, the liver itself, is anger. The lungs are the grief. And so these were literally the emotions that I had not expressed. And moreover, I'd been taking them in for everyone else as a therapist and amplifying them. So I became cognizant quite clearly, like as I was doing the work with the shamanic and we were cleaning the subtle bodies and going into ceremony and I was receiving visions and information and really learning how to work with my guides, that my illness, while it was a genuine physical manifestation, they realized that it was lupus and rheumatoid arthritis co-occurring. And sometimes it was lupus that was more dominant and sometimes it was rheumatoid arthritis. That said, it was a literal manifestation of the trauma that the body had suppressed. I had suppressed it for so long that it had to come out. And as so many famous trauma researchers have pointed out, the body will keep score. It will respond. It's usually the last of the subtle bodies to act out so dramatically. But that speaks to the level of disconnect that was going on during my traumatic experience. And so the shamans were so beautiful in letting me know that this had been a shamanic initiation. And so then I'm like, okay, well, what do I do with it? And they're like, it's already been done for you. And I'm like, what do you mean? I'm like, I need to go get certificates and study and you've got to teach me and I'm going to go here and there. And like my analytical scientist mind is like determined that I have to follow this structure to get there. And they're like, dear one, you already have the gifts. All you have to do is apply. There's nothing to study. We'll teach you the ceremonies. We'll teach you how to ground it through practice, through lived experience. But you already have it. It's about putting it out there and utilizing it. And for me, I knew I was never going to identify as a shaman. I knew that I would be a shamanic practitioner, that I had these gifts, but that wasn't the title that I was here to really be. And so after many, many years, in the 7th year following my NDE, I began speaking out. And from speaking out, I saw the gap in care regarding trauma and near-death experiences. I recalled my own experience. I saw myself in the eyes of countless others in the audience. And so I began to really focus my work on that gap in care. And then from that came my practice, which is an integrative healing practice. It's multidisciplinary psychology, which is all types of psychology that I've studied, clinical, depth, transpersonal, and beyond. It also incorporates neuroscience and quantum physics. And then I use vibrational medicine, predominantly shamanic energy medicine, but also I am of a Reiki lineage that's shamanic. And then I studied advanced quantum field work. So I combine those two to really work with people to heal mind, body, spirit on all 5 levels of the subtle body. So it really was my NDE that gave me all those gifts, but it was the process of reintegration that allowed them to be of service. And so I'm indebted to the shadow in a way, because it was from going from this profound mystical experience and coming back to the depths of the shadow and learning how to dance between as a walker between worlds, that I was able to realize I am here now when the collective is awakening. And that we're ready to be of service. This golden era of consciousness is arriving and there is no more fear.
Wow, wow, wow. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. It's so inspiring to me on so many different levels. If you don't mind, I'll just ask you a couple questions. I see we're nearing an hour here.
Yeah.
But you mentioned in your experience that you saw these 2 incredibly beautiful lights right before you went back. And those were your future children, right?
Yes,
and
they were.
I heard you in another interview talking about how the generation of children coming in now is more spiritually aware and connected. And I just have to say, I agree with you on that. as somebody who came out of religion myself, where I was taught that people are born sinners and that you have to discipline the sin out of your child. And that just was never my experience at all, either with myself or my siblings who were born after me, but especially with my children. I've always felt like they are at another level of spiritual connection. So what are your thoughts on that?
I concur wholeheartedly. I think that they come in with a knowing that's beyond words, and they're able actually to perceive and see so much more. When my now 8-year-old made it quite evident, he vocalized what I already knew, that he was an intuitive, but I didn't want to indoctrinate him. So I was waiting for him to show me the signs before I had those types of conversations and allowed the unfoldment. But he has just shown me that by allowing them to be as they are upon arrival and allowing them to explore and share and just validating these experiences of their orbs and their guides and their dreams and their travels and their just inner knowings, he's been able to retain all of his gifts through 8. And typically we lose much of that prior to 7 because the world either shames it out of us or it's invalidated out of us, or we're told it's all fantasy. And it's not.
One other question, and this is a difficult question, so if you're not comfortable with it, it's totally okay. I can edit it out. But you mentioned how you're a polytrauma survivor, and many of us have trauma from our childhood or even other types of trauma, because on my channel, people will comment who are from war-torn countries and just undergoing such extreme suffering. But in your experience, you were given the choice, you said, to either come back and work through the trauma now, or I think you said in another interview that you were given the choice to potentially come back and work through it in another life. And you chose to come back and work through that. Why do you think it is that we choose to do this in the first place, to go through this suffering?
I don't think it's, and that's where it gets tricky with the linguistics. Our souls know so much more than we do. And they don't see it, in my opinion, my humble opinion, as coming in for suffering. They see what the transmutation of said suffering will lead to. And that is really why I feel so many of us have these certain paths. But also, because humanity is evolving and we're ascending, many of us that are indoctrinated now and of a certain age and the generations before, we came for our ancestors. We came to heal the lineage so that these children that are coming in are able to come in with crystalline DNA activated, are able to come in with the gifts, because the ancestral baggage, the karmic baggage, we are clearing.
Wow.
And that comes from doing the work. But that's what's amazing about it, because if you're doing the work, as I know so many of your listeners are, you are not just healing yourself, you are healing your lineage throughout all time and space, and most importantly, 7 generations forward for the earth.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's so beautiful. I never thought of it quite like that. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about your work or how people can get in touch with you? I will have all of Brooke's links in the description and some of her upcoming events, so be sure to check those out.
Thank you. So I do have, if you wanted to check out Brooke Grove Healing on YouTube, that's my channel. I would love for you to subscribe and join us. The lives are on Friday at 7 p.m., but you can watch them through all time and space with live chat replay and join us. So I appreciate you checking in on that. I do have, for those that are interested, I always get asked about my book and I haven't finished it yet. So if you're interested in my writing, I share snippets of it on a private Instagram account because I like to create safe containers and know the energies that I'm calling in. And so if you'd like, you could also follow me there, which is at Brooke Grove Healing, all one word as well. So yeah, that's basically it. All the other events I'm excited about, and thank you for sharing. And
of course,
have me on. It's just an honor to always be of service and to be with such beautiful souls.
Thank you for watching the Love Covered Life podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and comment with your thoughts and opinions, and check the description box for the links to my free community where I share lots of resources, my Pay What You Can community where we do classes and challenges together, my TikTok, Instagram, my Clips channel, and lovecoveredlife.com where I share my paintings. Thank you so much for your support.